you do know Allard and you do know Prem already from previous talks. All the way to the left, we have Mr. David Caron. Hi David, welcome. David is a platform architect at Pivotal. He will also be presenting a keynote after this panel discussion. Pivotal is a great match, PCF with Axon, so looking forward to hearing more about that. We have Michael Kazarian, here to the right of me, architect at Promontech. Those of you who were here last year at the conference would already know him because you did a nice presentation about what you're doing. Still working very hard with Axon, I guess one of our most loyal and oldest users. So great to have you here. And then we have Bert Schrijver, personal friend of mine and NLJUG leader, and very experienced microservices practitioner as well at the police and other sites. So glad to have you here as well, Bert-Jan. So we have been talking a lot about microservices and Axon today, and I want to use this slot to take a few steps back and look at the bigger picture about microservices in particular. This is a chart that I always find really impressive. It's the Google Trends chart about the term microservices. You can do these things about any topic you like, of course, and it's always nice for us also to see how popular Axon framework is. But the thing that's remarkable about this particular chart is that it is so sharply defined. This isn't something that has been simmering for a long time. It became a thing in June of 2014. Not in August, not in January. It was around June 2014. That's when microservices suddenly started. I don't really know why, but it is a fact. And then if you look at the graph after that, you see them just increasing in popularity. There is no hype cycle going on here. It's not like it peaked and then became less popular. It's steadily growing. And this growth started more than 3 years ago now, so it's not a new thing anymore. It's not bleeding edge technology. It seems to be pretty mainstream. So it's a good moment to think about what we have learned. What have we learned from doing this in the past couple of years? And where will we be heading in the next couple of years? So I'll turn this off now. And the first thing I want to ask, and that's really taking a couple of steps back from where we are, is why would we do this? We've seen so many presentations today about complexity. As AxonIQ, we've created this Axon Server project, which helps you manage that complexity. But why exactly would you do that? And if you look, we had a very impressive case presented by Yuka and Giuseppe earlier. Very successful Axon project, but it's not really a microservices project. They're successful without microservices. So why on earth microservices? Bert-Jan, can I give you the honor?
Yeah, for me it's all about scalability and scaling on two aspects, both on the terms of teams, so being able to work with multiple teams on one product or one environment. It's easier if you work on lots of small components instead of working on one big component with multiple teams. So when you have multiple teams working on one system, you could maybe divide different services over the teams and make one team responsible for a subset of those services. And it's about scaling in terms of operations, being able to independently scale parts of your system. It's easier to divide your system over multiple VMs or multiple containers. And I think if you build a microservices system and you do it right, you can almost unlimitedly scale horizontally, which is a lot harder if you're building one big system.
Would everybody agree with that, or particular things to add? If I might challenge this a little bit, did you ever do the calculations on that to see if it actually works out?
Do you mean in terms of operational complexity or teams?
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things, right? So there's operational complexity. So you could imagine, well, if you didn't do microservices, you could have a bigger team and just deploy the larger thing. And people have been doing that for ages. So apparently that's a possibility. So is it really better to do microservices?
Well, I think the limits are a bit higher if you go into a microservice setting. So it's okay if you have one big application and you're working on it with a team of 7 or maybe 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12, but it will be difficult to work on one application with a team of 1,000. And if you have a product that's growing and growing and growing, it will be difficult in the end to run on one server. So as long as the scale is big enough, you will hit limits running in a monolithic scenario, which you might be able to avoid in a microservices setup. Obviously, it's a lot harder to work on a system with 1,000 people than with 10. But I think it's easier if you divide it in logical parts and split those logical parts over multiple teams.
I'd like to add something to that. So, although I agree with you, theoretically you could scale out a monolith just as well as any microservices environment. But what microservices give you is a very explicit boundary to every service. We, as a community, are really good at ignoring architects. Where have I heard that before? Architects have initially drawn really nice boxes and arrows on how communication and how components should interact. But as soon as those components are all available in the same JVM or whatever machine or whatever platform that you use, we will do that. We will find a way, a faster way to get to the component that we actually need. And we ignore all the architects. So even though technically it doesn't really matter whether we do microservices or monoliths, keeping those boundaries intact is so much easier if they're really explicit and they're really in your face, and even better, they're managed by another team, so you don't even get access to the other service. So I think microservices give us much more a better way to organize our teams to make sure that these boundaries are intact and managed properly instead of being lost somewhere in space.
So you get a healthier software architecture. That's basically the thing.
I think that that is a big factor in why microservices are better at scaling and at working. It's easier to work on them in larger teams because you can separate teams over these services.
So really, I have complete agreement there that when we started at my company, I remember interviewing people, and everyone at the time, we started 3 years ago, so I think that's, well, when that growth curve started going like this. And I made a concerted effort to let people know we're going to try and smartly, quote unquote, introduce the concept of microservices without that being a day one goal. And so what was our goal? Our goal initially was to start focusing on building business capability in our core domain, which in our world, it's a common theme you can hear around CQRSES, is in the loan space, in the mortgage space. And so, of course, our first service was called a loan. And organically, over time, we started evolving that. And that was all based on business functionality increasing, and then us having to take a step back and saying, where should that go? Does that go in our core domain? Or, wait, now I'm doing authentication authorization. Maybe that goes in an identity and access, because does that feel like a loan principle? Probably not. We had to store documents, create a doc management service. And back to reiterate what Allard was saying is that it helps me clearly define where people should be doing some type of work. Now, not to say there isn't fuzzy boundaries where people can make maybe less than optimal choices about where they implement a certain feature, but at least it gives some better guide rails to keep you on the road towards a more successful implementation. And that's helpful for me because, as you said, I could draw it on a diagram, but people will find a path if there's a path to the wrong way, if it's easier for them. And this is just another tool that we have to help mitigate that.
Thanks. Prem, there were some benefits mentioned of microservices. Did you actually experience those at Barclays over the past years? Do microservices deliver on their promises?
Well, some of my colleagues don't think we are doing microservices. So that's that. I did mention that we do still deploy as a monolith. I think I agree with Allard's point in terms of the discipline being a lot more explicit, where it's a lot more harder to abuse what doesn't belong to you. Right. And it's in a completely different team's purview, it's in a completely different process purview, so I can't interfere with something that some other team does. And that provides that clear boundary. The other thing is is the hardware advances as well. We can't ignore that, you know. So, I mean, this could have been possible 20 years ago, maybe, if the hardware was you know, up to scratch. You know, Moore's law has you know, come to, I think it's the end of it, or at least we are seeing it manifest in a completely different way, where you don't get more and more powerful CPUs, whereas 20 years ago, every 1 or 2 years you would have a much more powerful CPU come up, which was, you know, twice as powerful as the previous one. And the other part is the programmatic infrastructure. You know, so with AWS and all of these other cloud providers, it's a lot more easier to provision infrastructure, whereas previously that wasn't the case. So all of these put together, I think it's a fairly compelling story, but there's still quite a bit to do in terms of are you tall enough, right? It's not as if now I start doing microservices and I can start expecting to do a lot better, whether I was doing a monolith or a microservice. I mean, there is a different set of challenges to be solved with microservices. So to answer your question, you know, I think the benefits are harder to quantify in real terms, or at least I struggle. But at least in theory, maybe I think it's getting us to a better place.
Right. David, we haven't heard you yet. One thing I'd like to ask you, I think from your role, you visit quite a lot of different customers. So my guess is, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you have seen some microservices initiatives go well and others go not so well. Is that right?
Certainly.
So can you give us maybe some pointers? What are the key factors that make the good ones go well and the other ones go not so well?
Yeah, I think it has to do with whether you go in as a company, whether you go in strategically or not. I mean, if you are just at the fringes in some innovation lab, letting some of your best guys have fun, I wonder if it has real impact on your business, and ultimately what you're trying to achieve is deblocking your value chain, ultimately delivering the value that your business needs to deliver.
So did you say deblocking your value chain?
Yeah.
Is that like a pivotal slogan, or?
Well, I think more people have heard of.
What does it mean exactly?
Well, in the path from an idea to actual production, there are numerous things, that block the delivery of this value, and I think microservices are one of the tools to make, for instance, handovers and waiting for releases disappear, to make teams autonomous. And if you're willing to invest in that culture change, because ultimately it's a cultural thing, I think, microservices, yes, there's architecture behind it, but the goal is to make teams autonomous and focused on delivering value. Yeah, if you're not prepared to do all of that and not prepared to change the way you deal with infrastructure, then you'll have a hard time realizing the value of it.
Right. One thing that may be related to that, one thing that I sometimes find myself struggling a little bit to explain to people, is why about 10 years ago we were all doing service-oriented architecture, having small services, and then all of a sudden we found out that this was actually really bad and gave a lot of problems, and now we're saying, well, you should do microservices. Well, what's going on there exactly? How should you explain that?
Probably because Netflix didn't do SOA. Unfortunately, I think that's partially true. Even if you look at microservices and SOA, they're essentially the same thing. They're the same ideas, but I think it went wrong in marketing and adoption. So the big vendors got air of this SOA thing and started to sell SOA suites, and they were not the small products that you could use to get started quickly. The only thing that they did was make sure that loads of money were shipped to them, And they weren't really making it.
for an SOA suite, essentially.
Yeah, it could be an event-driven SOA suite. But as I said, it's all in marketing, so we call it microservices. It's much more sexy, and we have this association with cool technology because Netflix does it. And yeah, I think, I mean, it's strange to actually say it. I literally hear myself saying it, and it is strange. But I think that is indeed a big factor on why microservices picked up and SOA didn't. And I think it also has to do with what Prem said earlier. The infrastructure that we have nowadays is much more up to par to help us actually deliver it using small components, easy. If you want a VM, you just install it. You don't have to call the red guys or the blue guys next door for this really expensive suite that will probably help you out. No, you just
so
tell.
it was maybe a little bit too early given the state of infrastructure automation we had back then. Is that a...
I guess that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
But also maybe, sorry. Yeah, also maybe the emphasis was not so much on autonomy, but as we heard today in a couple of talks, I think empowered, a sort of centralized team ruling the bus to enforce like canonical data models onto teams. Yeah, which resulted in a totally different outcome, I think.
So we had a wrong organization doing it more so than the wrong technology.
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
Yeah, the one thing is that microservices are still a work in progress. I know we hear only the good stories. I mean, even the Netflixes and the Googles and the Amazons of the world. I'm sure there is. I mean, there are tons of problems. It's just that we only get to hear the success stories, right? So while it's easy to say, okay, microservices are a big success story. I mean, I would still be cautiously I'm cautiously optimistic about them. It's still not a given. So yeah, I mean that's where I am right now. To your previous question, no, I don't think we have sufficient proof to say that microservices make us go faster that much more. I mean, I certainly don't have that kind of information.
You said earlier that you have to be this tall to do microservices. That's a Martin Fowler quote, I guess, right?
It is.
Allard also loves to recall that sometimes. If we would zoom into that, what exactly is the yardstick? How can you measure how tall you should be? What is there? What kind of skills? What kind of organization?
Yeah, look, so for me it is the amount of automation that you have built into your process. So ultimately it's about the value stream, right? Somebody has a business idea, and how quickly can that business idea be deployed in production, gather feedback, and then react again to that business idea. Enhance it, and then that chain, right? So it's all about optimizing that chain. So the only way, at least the way that I can think of doing this repeatedly and reliably, is through high levels of automation. So that includes infrastructure automation, that includes test automation, that includes deployment automation. So the whole continuous delivery process. So that so it's important for organizations to map out what their value stream is, and find out where they take the longest amount of time. Is it in development? I mean, if you look at I can speak for where I work at. Development itself takes very little time, right? Whether monolith or microservice, but everything after that is the one that takes a huge amount of time. Getting the security approvals, getting the fraud sign-offs, getting the risk approvals, all of that adds up, right? So it's about putting automation in place for each one of those facets to reduce the value stream, and that's when you're going to get true value. So it's all about automation in the end for me.
Thanks.
I think we have a different problem. So I came from a big bank historically, and I could attest to the same details just stated. But in my current environment, I think we went this approach not with all the automation bells and whistles. We don't have the Netflix capabilities of like automatic delivery, continuous builds like that, but we are doing a phased approach to it. So what we're doing is, I was focused more on what I talked about earlier. How do I help enable my developers to focus on building the right code in the right area? And then also, with the benefits in mind that go along with that. I'm trying to get that isolation of testability and whatnot, but I then have a trajectory that as we start maturing, because we have plenty of room to mature, there's no question there within this space. I have at least, much like what Axon does, a path that allows me to start splitting my monolithic deployment of many 16, 18 microservices into independent deployments that happen as needed, not all together. We are doing it all together right now. And that has a strong parallel to what we pitch, what Allard pitches with respect to the Axon framework, right? Build a monolithic concept that has the ability to be broken apart over time. And we are slowly doing that. We are enhancing our automation of continuous build, integration, and even deployments to certain environments. We don't have the ability to just fire off releases at will, intraday, interday. There's actual compliance that we're associated with that dictates when we can do things. There are basically just training and process changes that our customers have to be integrated with. So we do have different constraints that we have to factor in. And really, if I was to distill what I said just now, it comes down to, it's like the agile process. There's no one-size-fits-all model for it. And I think within a microservice approach, there's a very similar principle that what's right for me might not be right for you. And you have to take that step back and figure out what is right for you in a short-term and long-term play, and then start implementing accordingly.
Thanks. Bert-Jan, I know you've done something evil, I think. I know you have been doing microservices projects without Axon. Is that right?
I'm not sure if I'm in the right position and audience here to comment on this. But yes, I confess, I've done microservices project without Axon.
Yeah. Now, you also know about Axon. You've also done it with Axon. So with Axon, of course, we have a very specific idea about how you should use DDD, CQRS, and event sourcing, and we believe that this will help you create better microservices systems. So you would have been in a position to judge that and have an opinion on that. So what do you think? Are we right? Do these... I'll protect you against Allard. But seriously, in your experience, what do these concepts bring to a microservices project?
Yeah, well, I'm a consultant, so the first thing I'm going to say is it always depends, right?
Yeah, now you're friends with Allard again.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're first starting out with your first project working with CQRS and event sourcing, then things seem more complex than just doing the plain old style. And I think I've had maybe conversations with you, Allard, about having a bit of more complexity in the beginning to have long-term, in the long term, have less complexity. Because if you just start building out without thinking about architecture, it will go fast in the beginning, and in the end, it will, well, kind of start itching a little, and maybe after a year or 2 years, you get stuck, and you need to throw it away and start all over. Well, that's where you, if you really think about your problem domain, and find the architecture and the technology that fits your problem domain, I think in the long run you'll have advantages about this. As with every technology and architecture choice, it depends on your organization and your business domain and also your technology domain, which will fit. So I don't think there's like a one-size-fits-all answer on whether to use Axon or CQRS or not. And the same thing goes for microservices. I think you really need to think. I think comparable thing is, let's say you would just build an old school monolith is one option, and the other option is to go with CQRS and event sourcing and or go with microservices. So I think the key question you need to ask yourself is like the added technical complexity, or in case of microservices, it may be operational complexity, because it's a lot harder to run microservices in production than just one monolith on maybe an application server. So is this added complexity, is it worth it for me, and is it going to solve problems in the long run, so that I need to take some complexity now and have advantages and lower complexity, and I can more easily deliver new features in the future? So I think you need to have some reasoning about this, and not just start with CQRS because you heard someone talk about it at a conference, or start with microservices because it will look good in your resume. Do it to solve business problems.
Thanks. Maybe this would be a good moment to give members of the audience also the opportunity to ask a question to the panel if anybody wants to. Jan, we have a microphone. Oh, you have to. It's already coming.
Well, I think that the term microservices came from Lewis and Fowler's article in March 2014. That's why
that's why the point is there. Well, thanks for enlightening me. Yeah.
But I've been following the microservices community for several years, attending conferences and so on. And I've been using the ideas and many with me before that, years before. But what I see, the years in that article, because that article is quite specific about microservice. But what is a microservice today? What does it mean when we're using the term microservice? What is it?
That's a fundamental question.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing it up. Does anyone care to dare a definition?
I read a nice tweet a couple of days ago, and my head is a sieve at the moment, so I can't exactly remember the exact tweet. But it was about looking at microservice. The thing that it is really about is the service part. It's about building services and having an architecture oriented around services. If you turn that around, I'm pretty sure what I'm getting at. So I think the key in microservice thinking or building is thinking in terms of services, and not humongous services. And I think the micro is an important marketing aspect to it. Keeping small, understandable. We saw the complexity. Was it simple, complicated, complex, chaotic schema earlier? A single service is simple, but it's part of a larger thing that is really either complex or chaotic. Usually chaotic, but we want it to be complex. But the human mind is not capable of doing that. And I think by splitting it down, we bring it down to pieces that we can understand. So it's really about that service thinking, and then keeping them small enough so that we can actually understand what a service does. And then from there start to understand what it can do in a context of things.
Just as a anecdote, I used to work at a company that defined microservices as things that are at less than 1,000 lines of code. It's a much easier definition.
I've got a picture for that. It has a beetle on top. That's my opinion, sorry. I also don't believe in two-piece teams. I mean, they'll just be starving. I don't think there's a size to microservices. It's the size of what fits in your head. I think that's much more important than how many people can you fit on a GitHub repo or something like that. Yeah.
The context, I think the whole by nowadays ubiquitous bounded context is one of the important factors that came onto just distributing your system to make them actually to enable this independence to scale, this independence to develop. I mean, just distributing your monolith doesn't give the same results. So I think this is a pretty defining combination.
Well, thanks. Any other questions from the audience?
Run. Yeah, there's another microphone.
Hello, panel. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, question I got really, Allard, earlier you talked about microservices not being noun-based. We were in a session with Matthias as well, and he was talking about aggregates not being noun-based as well. So as an architect who often gets ignored, I'm looking for some advice from you guys as to how we can convince our colleagues to try other things in terms of the naming of microservices.
So instead of looking for nouns, I would look for business capabilities, so to say. What is the service you're providing? What is it that you're doing? So if you look at a business department, they're called accounting. That's a process. They're not called account. You're not going to the account department and everything that's related to an account. No, there's a certain process that you have in your company, and you should have services to support those. It really comes back to the word service, right? You're providing a service, literally, to support a business process. And I think the orientation around the actual business process is much more important. And yes, somewhere there's going to be nouns, right? But it's not the first thing. It's probably the verbs first. I think that's trimming it down a bit too far as well. But that would be my first look.
Any other comments on that? No. Then I'd like to use the final minutes of this panel to look a little bit into the future. I think we already discussed in Prem, you've made a lot of points about that you need to have a lot, microservices depend on a lot of things, about build automation, programmable infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. You see new things popping up in that space all the time. If you look at where we are now, what's missing there? What are the holes in that market that needs to be filled, and what we'll be talking about next year if we have this conference again? Anybody dare to look into the future?
Yeah, definitely. I think in order to be successful with building a microservices system, it's vital that you're really good at operations. You're really good at rolling out new services, scaling services, and I think the amount of time you need to go from the snap in your head like, oh wow, this should be a new service, until this new service is running in production should be as easy as possible and as short as possible. Because if getting a new service out there means, okay, I need to get up from my desk and walk to the ops guy, and he needs to, I don't know, click in his VM manager to fire up a new VM, and then I need to click in Jenkins, create Jenkins jobs, and so on and so on. It will keep you from setting up a new service. So I think we can win in terms of solutions that can help getting new services out there. So I'm not saying this because David is sitting here, but the ease with which you can deploy a new service on Cloud Foundry is just like you create a YAML file and you push something and it's there. And I don't need to worry about VMs or containers or build packs or whatever. As a developer, I want to deploy a service. That could be my user story, right? I want to deploy a service without worrying about infrastructure and networks and whatever. And I think we're going to see some more ease of use there in the future, because I think currently there are a couple of solutions that can really help. But for me as a developer, the life can become a bit more easy.
Okay.
Well, I spoke about it during my talk as well. I think inter-service testing is without having to rely on your entire ecosystem being present is going to get a lot more support, I think. I mean, it's already seeing a lot of momentum these days with frameworks coming in place to allow us to do that quicker, faster, cheaper. I guess the fashionable thing to say is that now we'll be deploying functions as a service, or serverless. But I'm not sure about that yet, or maybe I'm very old-fashioned.
What are your doubts about it?
I think there are still problems to be solved. I think it's, for example, latency is an issue. Warm-up is an issue. For example, the JVM, if you have shut down your JVM, just starting up the JVM takes several seconds. Spring Boot, right now an app takes anywhere close to 30 to 60 seconds. I mean, you can't really, have startup times that long, yeah. Right? So again, that will, I think there will be optimizations in that space before we can actually adopt things like serverless as a ubiquitous thing. Or we'll say that there are certain runtimes that are not suitable, and maybe Node is the answer. But I think that's where a lot of the focus is probably going to be in the next year or so.
So I guess what I'm looking for is, once again, I'm always looking for the operational efficiencies that I can have to just actually get my code that aligns with what the business is asking for done quicker, smarter, higher quality. And so I think my partner over here was saying that it's all about simplifying really the complexity around infrastructure. I want to take it out of the mix, right? I mean, I think we've heard of the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid. Well, I think of it as the MISS method, make it simple, stupid. I'm hitting it all. I'm going crazy with acronyms this week. Yesterday I had a different one, but make it simple. Make it so my engineers don't have to be infrastructure or ops specialists. They should be able to be domain-driven design specialists in my domain, which is that mortgage space. Right now, that's not the case. Right now, in a microservice approach, I do have folks who are sitting there battling with different Docker containers and standing up environments to try and test something that is new functionality, new feature development, or they're trying to triage a problem that is being reported in a production or a staging environment. And I see some light at the end of the tunnel. It's not the panacea that I would hope, but it still is a step in the right direction. And we are going to be vetting out, like the Axon Hub and its capabilities with the database, which Axon Server, I guess, as of today, because it does really eliminate some of those pain points that I have specifically noticed, which is developers breaking what I would view as our best practices with respect to how they communicate cross microservices and doing really, in essence, very tightly bound microservices, knowing one service does something. So I'm going to specifically ask it, and then I'm going to ask that thing. And I'm in essence building orchestration inside of whichever service feels right. And ideally, I don't do that. Ideally, I do get to have that transparency, or that's not the transparency, but the animicity, I guess, about who is answering the questions that I have for specific data, and I just ask for it, and I get the answer or answers, and I make a choice what to do with that. That is a step in the right direction, and of course I think that's just the first step in the right direction. There's many more to come.
Thanks. So Allard, I guess your answer to the question would drive the product development as well, right? What kind of stuff you would feel is currently missing and we need to have in Axon. So could you tell me a little bit about the high-level plans for
I'll guess we'll have to see that really next year. But no, so I think there's a number of aspects. If you think about a microservices system and not so much an implementation, but it as a system, AxonIQ is very focused on making all these non-functionals. Sorry, Russ. Simpler, right? Well, there's a lot of application level stuff that we want to get out of your heads on a daily basis, and make sure that you can focus on building the business logic, the things that makes you different from the guy next to you, right? If that is your competitor or whatever. If it's your colleague, you're probably working on the same thing. But that's our goal, right? To make that part simpler. My neighbor here has a similar goal, but then on a, fortunately, different level. But if you look at what conferences, maybe not this one, but other conferences would look like, I think there's one aspect in the system that's going to be the most difficult one to get away with or to work with, and that's the people. It's not so much about getting the thing up and running anymore, but it's going to be much more about how do you actually build the right thing. And in the end, that makes software development much more of a people thing, because the technology, well, it's going to be just there. So you can almost compare it to driving a car. If you have a very old car, you really have to know how it works to even get it started, right? You have the poke, or I don't know what do you call it in English, but you have to twist some knobs before it would actually start, especially on a cold day, right? Now you just press the start button and you don't care. It's out of your mind. Honestly, the only thing I need to do is press start. Oh, I still have a steering wheel to use, but even there's cars without that. And that's, I guess, what we are doing on the software. Make it more about, well, make sure that the ride that you still have, the 2-hour drive that you're making with the people next to you, make sure you can actually have a conversation and make it an enjoyable ride. and choose the right destination, of course. But that's something we cannot do for you. So I guess that's what conferences will be about in some years from now, hopefully.
We'll see. No, David, actually, I don't want to hear your answer. Because you will have a keynote, and you get the stage all to yourself to present it, and it's time for that now. So I want to thank all the panel members very much for being here and answering the questions.